helps shed a little light on what we as a people have been through. So first, I want to acknowledge God and thank God for this. This fine young man here, there's a little more to this story about how we ran into each other, because it is truly divine providence.
Yeah.
My wife and I, we were planning to go on vacation, and we were going to a part of the world where it's hot, and I needed to get some new clothes, and the trip was coming up real soon, and I was sort of in a rush. I had a lot of things on my list of things to do. And I was in Baltimore, and I was like, okay, I got to do this, I got to do this, and I got to do this. Which order should I do these things in? And I'm driving down the street, and Justin and Scott said, you know what, I'm going to go to K&G right now. And I made a turn, I went this way, I came around the back of security, came up into K&G, went and found some pants, and I was like, I got to try these on, because I don't know if my waistline is what it used to be. So I go into the dressing area, and this guy says, hey, I know you. And a lot of people in Baltimore say they know me. And I be figuring, you know, somebody out here looking like me owes somebody some money. And I don't want to be that guy. I'm like, are you sure you know me? You sure I'm the guy you're talking about? Because I don't really recognize you. I'm 61 now myself. So there's a little dust up here too. And I'm trying to figure, and then the voice hit me. I said, yeah, okay, yeah, now I remember you from Western Tech. And Western Tech was the last school that I worked at in Baltimore County before I retired from the Baltimore County public school system. So it's been a minute. But it told me, when he shared all of this story with me, it said to me, well, I have to do this. I have to be here and share what it is, what little I may know. Yeah. And hopefully, you know, it will reach the people who need to hear. So with that said, I'll begin. But you know, there's some things that happened this morning, and I'm gonna try not. I tend to be a little long-winded, but I try not to be. But I always fail, and I always over-prepare, and I always do too much. So if I get to go too long, you know, just say, hey man, you're going too long. I'm gonna try to keep it confined here, and because y'all threw me off. And ever since we talked, we got back from our vacation, and I totally forgot about this. You called me up and said, hey, oh man, I forgot. And so it has been worrying me what to share, you know, what to say and what to think about. And the way I prepare for stuff is it has to live in my head, right? I know I got a talk coming up. I get my ideas together, and they have to live in my head for some time, so I can really share authentically what it is that I'm trying to say. So I'm trying to think, how do I approach this? And because this is, he asked me to do this during Black History Month back in February, and I couldn't do it, but I still wanted to talk about the theme for Black History Month this year, which is Black resistance. As many of you may already know, back in 1926, Carter G. Woodson, lapel pin I am wearing, the founder of the Association for the Study back then of Negro Life and History, also known as today the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, which he was a founding organizer of back in 1913, but in 1926 they started something called Negro History Week. And it was started to counteract the many lies and misconceptions and falsehoods that have been taught to Black people, to people of African descent, and people all over the world. But the challenge for us was that many of us, we internalize these lies, we internalize these falsehoods, these ideas that Africa has nothing to contribute to humanity, that Africans were running around in the jungle naked with spears, killing each other and being cannibals, when the furthest from the truth was that. The foundation of civilization is rooted in African culture and African society and African history. But in any case, that is what the Negro History Week was founded to do. And over time, it progressed from 1970 to 1976, it developed into Black History Month. And ever since its inception, the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, now African American Life and History, has created a theme every year for it. And this year's theme is Black Resistance. So that's my topic for today. And so I as I said, I try to live in what I'm going to share, and I attempted to try to live in this idea of Black resistance, right? And so when we think of Black resistance, we often think of Nat Turner, we often think of Denmark Vesey, we also often think of the Maroons in South America and here in the United States as well, Africans who escaped from slavery and went and established their own free communities. We often think of that. But resistance is a spectrum. There's all kinds of resistance, and it goes from things as simple as saying no to something, or even thinking, no, I'm not going to do something, all the way to the other end of the spectrum where you fight and take lives to resist what is being pushed against you. So it's a spectrum of resistance. So I sort of want to talk about that spectrum, and I was moved today by the spirit in here. So it's sort of going to throw me off track of where I lived in my head, but I think I'm going to try to get to where we're going. So this idea of resistance, right? When we resist, resistance is pushing back. We're pushing back against something, right? So we can look at it as if we're saying no to something. So what is it that we have been saying no to? And what I want to do is sort of take you on a journey through the African American experience, and this is where we might go a little long, but I'm going to try not to, of how we wound up here in the United States of America and the resistance that our ancestors and we still today put up to get us to where we really need to be. And we'll talk about where that place is. And this is a part of that place. This church is a part of the place of where we really need to be, at least in my thesis and the argument that I'm trying to make here when I'm talking about resistance. So resistance is paired with something, right? We're resisting against something. And we resist in many different ways against something. That young man back there, he may resist against his parents. Are you a teenager? Yes. A young teen. Can I ask how old you are? 18. So you're a little bit older, but you went through those 14 and 15 years age when you really resisted what your parents were telling you to do. Now, I don't want to do that. I got this whole other thing going on. So you were resisting, but you wanted to do something else on the other side. There was the resistance from what our parents want us to do when we're younger, because we want to do something else. And it's the same for us as a people. We were resisting against oppression because there was something else on the other side that we wanted. And keep that in mind as we go through this. What is the thing that we as a people really wanted? Throughout all of our experience, from the time that the first Europeans came to our homeland in Africa and attempted to grab our ancestors, transport them to the shores, put them into slave dungeons and barracoons on the coast, load them up on the ships, transfer them across the Atlantic Ocean, and bring them to the Americas. There was something that we wanted on the other side of that resistance. Just keep that in mind. What was it that we really wanted? What was it that we were looking for? Now, I argue that there are three things that we were looking for once we got here to this shoes. Many people say, and I'm sort of going through here, right? So many people say that when, and let me step back for a moment. I don't want us to get the understanding that our history begins with slavery. It does not. I'm starting this talk with slavery because we're talking about resistance. But our history is much greater than we begin when we were slaves. No, our history begins when we were home, before we even got here. That's where our history begins. Our history does not begin in the United States of America or in colonial America. it begins with our ancestors who were taken from their homelands, who were just living everyday lives in their societies and civilizations, from great people to bad people, just like human beings all over the world. That's what was going on, and that's where our history really begins. So if we really want to understand African American history, we have to understand African history. Because really, African American history is a part of African history. It's an extension of it. But that's a whole nother story, but in any case. So, come with me on this journey. So, resistance by African American people has been there ever since the first Europeans arrived in Africa. The earliest, the European transatlantic slave trade begins around 1521. And it starts with the Spanish and the Portuguese. We know we got the story of Christopher Columbus sails the ocean blue in 1492. Shortly after that, the Spanish and the Portuguese are battling with each other to take control over South America. The Portuguese really wind up on the top, and the Spanish come in a little later. But in any case, that's where it begins. And at that first stage, there are many different ways that Europeans acquired Africans. In that first stage, there were direct raids into African societies and communities. There's a story of the African Equiano. He tells his story of how he was captured. And he was, and the society that he came from knew that there were slave raiders. And what they would do is the parents would go out and work in the fields, and the young people would be left in the compounds, and there was always somebody who would be up in the trees looking out for the slave raiders to come into their community. And they would routinely fight them off. Unfortunately, Equiano and his sister were captured. And they were taken, and they were put into bags. And they were taken by these slave raiders who were Africans and Europeans. And we'll get to why the Africans were involved. But they were Europeans and Africans together. And they lived about 200 miles from the coast of Africa. They were inland. And they were sold over and over and over again to within the African communities. Slavery in Africa was very different from slavery amongst the Europeans. If you were enslaved in an African society, it was either because you were a captive of war, you were paying off a debt, or your family had committed some kind of crime in which a family member had to be enslaved to that family. And in many instances, a person who was enslaved in African slavery was considered a part of the family. This young lady right here, if she were my slave, my son might marry her, and she'd become a part of the family. And we were not considered property. It was a part of the social system, sort of like a welfare kind of system. But the Europeans switched it around and turned us into property. And they said that Africans had no souls, that we were like horses and donkeys and ducks and fish and all other kinds of things that we could set up for a value and buy and sell, because we had no souls. We were not considered to be humans. But in any case, you wind up on the coast of Africa. And again, all along the way, there's resistance. There are people who try to run away. There are people who fight. There are people who do all kinds of things. While they're held on the coast of Africa and they're taken through the door of no return, they fight. How many of you saw Woman King? The scene in Woman King where they are fighting at the slave castle on the coast, these things are true. These things occurred. And the Woman King is a good example of it. There's a queen in Zinga lived in Angola. And she was the leader she was the queen. And she fought against the Portuguese, as well as the Dutch, as well as other Africans who sided with the Portuguese and the Dutch to enslave her people. And she fought them off for many years until she died. Zinga died in the 1860s. But in any case, this is just one of those examples of how we fought back very early on in many different ways. We're on the slave ships now. Okay? So been captured, transferred to the coast, held there, sold to the Europeans who come up on the slave ships. And this whole mechanism of slavery is a very, very complex system that Europeans put together over hundreds of years. And when you talk about slavery, you got to look at the different time periods when it's occurring and which European nation is involved, because it's very different and it's not the same in every place. So you have Europeans who are starting out in Europe. You have where they outfit their slave ships. They get all of their materials together. They get their crew, and they travel to the coast of Africa. And on the coast of Africa, they had slave castles where the mechanisms of slavery would get captured Africans and hold them on the coast in what could be considered warehouses. These slave castles and what were known as barracoons, they were like cages, open air cages, where captives were held until the captains of the slave ships came and purchased. And the Europeans, they were in such competition with each other. If you look at the slave castles, you'll see that the cannons are pointing out to sea, not inland, against the Africans who they might think would be coming to attack them, but they were pointing out to sea to fight against the other Europeans who would be coming to take over their castles. But in any case, this is the way the system was set up. So the Europeans would leave either from the Americas or from Europe. They'd outfit their ships with their crew. They would come to the coast, they'd trade whatever it is they had, and they would purchase Africans. And then that's when our Great Maafa would continue. And the Great Maafa just simply means, it's a Swahili word that means Holocaust. It's the African Holocaust, this whole system, the Great Maafa. So what occurs on the slave ships, again, there's resistance all along the way. And you think about it. Whatever age you are right now, imagine being kidnapped. Your family you're lost to your family. You're taken by strangers. You're placed on this ship, and you don't know what is going to happen. Equiano, he's a young boy. He's a teenager when he's captured, and what he thought was going to happen was that these people were going to eat him. So that's what somebody had told him. They said they were going to take us to their land and eat us, and he was petrified. And when he found out that they were going to enslave him, he said, okay, well, it may not be too bad, because he had been enslaved amongst his own people, but he did not know what he was about to deal with. Now imagine if you were on this slavery, and the conditions on the slaves. You're kept down below. Anybody ever get seasick? Been seasick? So imagine being in a boat, on a boat. You're inside, down below, in the hull of the ship. Anybody been to the Great Blacks and Wax Museum? You should. If you're living in Baltimore, you got to go to the Great Blacks and Wax Museum. Yeah. You have to see two exhibits, if no others. You have to see the lynching exhibit downstairs, and you have to see the slave ship exhibit. And the slave ship exhibit is very good because it really shows what it was like. We were kept as cargo on shelves, laid flat, chained to each other, people above you, people below you. And you were not allowed to move. You would be allowed to move about once a day, to go up on top, to get some air, to move around, to keep you healthy. And in those conditions, male, female, young and old, the women were kept separate from the men, but you were all chained together. And you could not get up and move. So imagine being chained down for hours and hours on end, for weeks and weeks on end, into months. And what's happening there is you're stuck there. You can't get up and go to the bathroom. If you get sick, you're vomiting right there. The people below you are getting that. Now imagine what these are old wooden ships. Imagine the smell. And when Equiano first got on the slave ship, he said the first thing that greeted him was the smell. He could not take the smell of the ship. Any of you ever watched the original Roots series, the original one that came out in the 70s? I strongly encourage all of you to watch it. It does a very, very good job of portraying these first steps that I'm talking about here in the transatlantic slave trade. Now imagine, these are the conditions that you're in. And these Europeans, they don't have any women on these ships. So imagine what they're doing to our sisters, our mothers, our aunts, our children. These are horrible beings, and they did terrible things. So the question is, what is the resistance? How did we resist? What did we do to fight back against this? And what are we fighting back against? And we're fighting back against physical enslavement. We're fighting back against being captured and being forced to live a life that we don't want to do. So in this instance, this is what we're fighting back against. So what do you think folks might have done in their response? Not even resistance. How do people respond to things like this? And I'm asking, feel free to call out. What do you think folks might have done?
Try to escape.
Trying to escape?
Yeah.
Okay, so that was one. These Europeans were so dastardly that what they were doing, because many Africans attempted to jump overboard when they were brought on top, what they did is they put nets around the ships.
Wow.
To slow down the attempt to climb up the neck to jump overboard. So if there's no net, they can just jump over and be gone. But if there's the net, they got to climb up the net, and at least it would give the crew some time to possibly capture them and bring them back in, because at this time, an African body is worth money. It's a very valuable commodity. So you don't want to lose it. So you get as many as you can. So that's one response, is to try to escape, jumping overboard. What are some other things you might do? There are no wrong answers.
Fight back.
Yeah.
Fight back.
Revolt.
Okay? Revolt. All right? And one of the most famous revolts that we know of, and there were many, and this is one of the reasons why the slavers were so horrible and had such terrible conditions, is because the crew was so petrified and so scared of Africans revolting, because they always did. Don't get it twisted. Nobody's just got on the slave ship and said, okay, master, I'm going to go on and do what you say. No, every step of the way, there was fighting back. And one of the most famous examples of this is the Amistad. How many of you are familiar with the story of the Amistad?
Yeah, I watched it.
Okay, let's just check out the movie. And there's a brother by the name who led this revolt, Joseph Sinkay. Okay? On this slave ship, and it's a little bit of the legalities around slavery, right? The transatlantic slave trade, transporting captured Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas by the United States, as well as Great Britain and other European powers, was outlawed in the early 1800s. The United States said no, by 1808 you can't bring any more fresh Africans into the United States of America. You can't do that anymore. So the Amistad takes place, I believe, in like the 1839 is when the Amistad occurs, this revolt. A Spanish slave ship had taken Africans from Africa. And the way the slave trade worked, once you left Africa, once they got their cargo of Africans, generally they brought them to the Caribbean islands. And in the Caribbean islands is where the process, and again, I'm telling you, this is this whole system that they had put in place. This is where seasoning took place. This is where they would, because the Caribbean islands, to be enslaved on the Caribbean islands was rough. The French, the Spanish, the British, the Dutch, all those Caribbean islands folks like to go to now for vacation and having a good time. They made, in today's money, billions of dollars for European nations. But they were death camps for Africans. Jamaica, the British colony, sugar. We often think of slavery and we think of cotton. but it was sugar. You can't pick up anything today and eat it without getting sugar. That Domino sugar factory down there, sugar was the key. Cutting that sugar cane, that was the key. The average life expectancy of an enslaved African in Jamaica was 7 years.
Wow.
7 years. And the Europeans, the British in particular, they didn't care. They didn't care because it was cheaper to work you to death in 7 years and just get another one to replace you. It was like replacing a part in a machine. And literally that's what they viewed us as, parts in their machine, their mechanisms of slavery. So the Spanish ship, it captures a bunch of Africans. Initially, it was about 120 Africans on this ship. They get to Cuba. They take the African, they split up the cargo, and there are about 50 or so Africans that they put onto this Cuban ship that is going to now go through the Caribbean islands, and in each island they would stop and they would sell some Africans, right? So that was how this system worked. Me, I'm an investor living in Spain. I take my money, I invest it into a trading company that is trading slaves. They outfit the ship, they hire a captain, get the crew, supply it up. They go to Africa, they say we're going to pick up X number of captured Africans and we're going to sell them in the Americas. We're going to trade in the Americas, get some raw goods and bring them back here to Spain. These were very, very, very lucrative investments. They made literally billions of dollars in today's money. This is how Europe and the United States was built off of this economic system. But in any case, so this is what their plan was, to go through the Caribbean islands and sell these Africans. But Sinkay, who was the leader of the revolt, had different plans. They revolted. They killed the captain, killed the cook, and held the other crew captive and told them to sail the boat back to Africa. And what they did was, by day, they navigated the ship towards Africa, but by night, they would turn the ship back and go north. And eventually they wound up in New England. And an American ship intercepted them, found out what happened, and took the ship into custody and charged the Africans with murder. So they charged the Africans with murder. To make a long story short, goes through the American judicial system. And mind you, the president of this time, I think it was Van Buren, the president, and W.C. Pennington, an African-American abolitionist. He was the leader who got lawyers together to defend the captured Africans and to ultimately win their case. They won their case. They said, no, this is not murder. These were Africans who were illegally captured. We cannot consider them as property because they were not property. They were captured illegally, so no, you cannot claim them, Spain and Portugal. The United States government challenged the decision along with the Spanish government because the president didn't want to have problems with Spain. So he said, no, we got to get these slaves back to Spain. We got to get them back. But they went to the Supreme Court. John Quincy Adams, former president, who by this time was an abolitionist, he defended the captured Africans on the Amistad, and the case was won. Those Africans were returned back to Sierra Leone, and this is another example of resistance. Like you said, one of the responses was to rebel, was to fight back. This was a successful rebellion. There were many rebellions. This is just one that has been made quite a bit of, but there were many rebellions. And these were some of the reasons why the Europeans on this Middle Passage would have these draconian systems put in place to keep Africans from fighting back. Other things that Africans would do to resist, as I said, this is a spectrum of resistance, was refuse to eat. They would refuse to eat and starve themselves to death. They did not want to live. They would attempt to commit suicide. And if you had a child, many women would commit infanticide. They would kill their infants and children because they did not want them to live a life that these devils that they saw was going to have in store for them. Many who were pregnant aborted their pregnancies so as not to bring a child into this world. So these are many different ways in which Africans resisted. And then there were some who just went crazy. Their minds could not take it. Just imagine. You don't know where you're going. You don't know what's going to happen. You are just day after day being what was considered food is basically leftovers that the Europeans had and some mush, some kind of cornmeal slopped together that you would eat daily. Very rarely you would get meat. You had just enough water to barely survive. Remember, these are old wooden ships, and you're down below. The vast majority of Africans who died on the Middle Passage, they died as a result of the flux. Anybody know what the flux is? What's the flux? Speak loud. Yes, and you lose your bodily fluids primarily from diarrhea. This is what was happening. You were dehydrated. You had no fluid in your body. And as we know, our bodies are made up over 60% of water. You lose that water, your organs are not going to function. You are going to die a very slow death. And in many instances, that's what occurred. I don't want to get too bogged down in this part, but I'll give you one more instance of the brutality of this. There was a slave ship called the Zong. Anybody hear of the Zong? Z-O-N-G? This was a British slave ship. And this shows how horrible these people were and how this system worked. The captive Africans on the Zong were insured by Lloyd's of London. Yes, the same Lloyd's of London that exists today. And the captain of the slave ship was running out of food. He didn't have enough food and water to take care of all the captive Africans that they had on the ship. And captains had two different kinds of ways. They had two philosophies of how they would pack the slave ships. They had one philosophy that was a tight pack. They said, we're going to stuff as many of them on here as we can, because they had an order to fill. Those slave ships that left out of Europe and the America, they said, you need to deliver us X number of captives to sell in the markets. So the philosophy was, in order for us to reach that number, we'll just stuff as many of them as we can in here. We know we're going to lose some. We know some of them are going to die along the way. We just chuck their bodies overboard. But by the end, we'll have the number that we're supposed to have. That's the tight pack. Then you had other captains who had the philosophy of a loose pack. And the loose pack was, well, let's take as close to the number as we're supposed to get and try to keep as many of them as alive as we possibly can. Any extra ones that we have, we can sell on our own and make our own money off of it. And that was what a lot of captains did. They would have an order for X number of slaves. They would overstuff. They'd bring extras because any other ones that they sold, they kept that money and they pocketed it. This is another part of this thing. But the Zong, the captain was like, look, we're not going to be able to, this is not going to be able to work. We're not going to be able to feed and survive. All these people aren't going to be able to survive. So they counted off X number of people, chained them together, and threw them overboard. And put in an insurance claim for lost cargo. That's how they viewed our ancestors, as cargo. These aren't humans. Well, we lost some horses on the trip. Let's put in an insurance claim. And we know about this because the claim was denied. But look it up, the Zong, that's the ship. But I don't want to get bogged down in that, so, because you got to get us to the United States. Am I going too long?
No, you good.
You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. Because we haven't gotten to y'all yet. Y'all, so You took me somewhere else, other than where I was going. But I'm doing. I'm gonna do what you said. I'm following the Spirit.
Okay.
So this is where the Spirit. This is not what. I'm just gonna follow the Spirit.
Okay.
All right. So.
Real good. He's real good.
All right. So we have always. This is something that you said earlier as well. That God is always making a way, right?
Yeah.
And this is the theme for our resistance, is that we have always found a way. God has always made a way for us.
Wow.
As long as we followed it, we've been okay when we follow that way. And this is where our resistance levels come from. So we've got captured, we've made it to the coast, we held on the coast, through the door of no return, onto the slave ships, to the Americas, fighting all the way. We get to the last stage of this process, which is arrival in the Americas and sail. We've been seasoned. Now now mind you, when I say the Americas, a whole new world was created. You remember back in elementary and high school when they talked about the old world and the new world? Well, this new world is also referred to as the Atlantic world. And it was the Atlantic world made up between the west coast of Africa, the Atlantic Ocean coast of South America, the Caribbean islands, North America, and Europe. That world was the new world, because the old world was Europe, Northern Africa, West Africa, Asia, all the way over to the Far East. That's the old world. A comparison might be the Orient and the Occident, the East and the West. So we have this new world. So here we are arriving in this new world. Now, we are in the United States of America. The overwhelming majority of us are here purely by accident. We all probably have some cousins down in Brazil and the Caribbean, in maybe Mexico, somewhere in South America. We may have some cousins up in Canada as well, because of the way that these slavers work. Like I said, that slave ship, me, my brother Jenkins over here, this sister right here, we might have all got captured in the same raid on our neighborhood, on our community, by the British. And the British had properties or colonies in the Caribbean as well as in North America. So my blood brother might have got sold in Jamaica. And I wound up in South Carolina.
Wow.
So this is the way that this new world, this Atlantic world, this was how we are mixed into it, right? So when I think of African American, I don't think of the United States of America. I think of the Americas. We are all African Americans. We are all Africans, descendant Africans in the Americas. We just wound up in what became the United States of America. We might have a cousin, like I said, in Brazil or in Curacao or in Jamaica or somewhere else. We just happen to be who our ancestors were captured by and who they got sold to. And it's so this is our world, but we're in the United States of America. So this is where I sort of want to jump off, right? So many people argue that when we were transported across the Atlantic Ocean, that we lost everything. That we lost our culture, we lost our language, but most of all, they said we lost our religion, that we lost our faith. And I argue, as other historians have argued, that it is our faith was the one thing was one of the things that we kept as an African retention that aided us in our survival and was the greatest form of resistance that we could have. It is that spirituality. Marimba Ani is a cultural anthropologist. She used to be at Hunter College and City University of New York. She's was a student of Dr. John Henry Clark. I don't know how many of you are familiar with who he is, but he's a grandfather of Black history. In any case, she has she talks about the ethos of African people as an anthropologist. And she talks about this concept of the utamarau. It's a Swahili term, utamarau. And it means the essence of what makes us who we are. And in this church today, we could see the essence of who we are. And the essence of Black people, the essence of African people, our ethos is our spirit, is spirituality. They could not take the spirit out of us. They could not remove it. It exists in y'all here today. That spirit that you exude, that comes from the root of what your Africanity is. It is the essence of who you are. When we got here, and I'm speaking about the United States of America, the British were devious. They were some devious folks. They said, okay, you have to understand, slavery they didn't come here with a system of slavery all set up and say, okay, here's the book on slavery, this is how we're going to do it, let's make it happen. It developed over time. The colonial period, first British wind up here in what would become the United States of America in like 1607. About 100 years after the transatlantic slave trade begins. They set up in Jamestown. The first captured Africans who come here to be enslaved are in 1619. You guys heard of the 1619 Project? New York Times, look up the 1619 Project. Look it up. This is when the first Africans were brought here and sold into slavery. But prior to that, there were Africans here working as indentured servants. Benjamin Banneker, right out here in Oella. His father married a white woman, became free, and owned his own land. This is how Banneker becomes a free man. He votes. This system of slavery does not exist at the onset. They develop it over time. Okay? So what would become the United States of America is initially a society with slaves. It's very different from a society based on slavery, which is what America comes to be, a society based on slavery. So what these Europeans did, right? Many Africans, when they got here, they adopted Christianity. And one of the laws that the Europeans had was that you can't enslave another Christian. Well, when Africans started becoming Christians, they changed that law. So your Christianity did not prevent you from becoming enslaved. And they got to the point where and it took time, it took to the 1670s in Virginia, for them to establish a law that says all Africans will be enslaved, will be slaves for life. And you will follow the condition of your mother. If your mother is a slave, then you too will be a slave for life. Because there were many white men who had relations with Black women and had children. And vice versa. There were many white women who had relationships with Black men and had children. Those children were free. This is how Banneker gets to be free. His mother's white. But what do as they continue to further enslave Africans? They make it against the law for interracial marriages. So that takes care of that. So this is this ongoing process of creating a slave society. But what Africans do, the British will only allow you to be a Christian. And the Christianity, there was a special Bible that they made for Africans that they preached out of. And they preached that you were supposed to be, if you wanted to get to heaven, You had to follow your master's commands and be a good slave. That you are descendants of Ham, and Ham's descendants were destined to be the bearers of wood and drawers of water. That this was your role. This is what you were supposed to do. And if you're a good servant, if you're a good slave, when you die, you'll go to heaven. Now imagine. You're born on a plantation out on the eastern shore like Frederick Douglass was, and many other Africans. You're born out there. This plantation is maybe 30 square miles. You're born there. You grow up there as a child. You live and work there as an adult. And you die there. You never leave. You don't have a phone where you can, check out what's happening on the latest TikTok. You don't have CNN. You don't have the news. You don't have anything going on. All you know is what is going on that plantation and what that plantation owner is telling you. And this is the Christianity that he's giving you. And that's all you know. That's all your children know. That's all your children's children know. And the key here is, the goal is to keep you ignorant. So going back to the question of what were we resisting? Frederick Douglass, when he was a little boy, when you were a little kid, and some of you are young now, when you were a little kid, you're growing up and you got these questions in your head that you're just curious about. My question for me when I was a kid, I still haven't gotten an answer to it, is what's it going to feel like when I die? But you have to have questions like, my uncle, right? He grew up in the South, right? And they moved to Newark, New Jersey, and he saw a guy come out of the building, and he walked that way, and then he saw the guy about 10, 15 minutes later come back this way, and it blew his mind. He said, what? Because he's used to being out in the country. So when you walk out that way, the only way you coming back is from that way. He had no concept of walking around the block. Dude just walked around the block. What is going on here? How did he do that? But when we're young, we have these questions in our heads. And Frederick Douglass had this question in his head: how is it that white people are free, and we as black people, why are we the slaves? And he couldn't figure it out. He couldn't figure it out until one day when he had been shipped off to Baltimore by his owner, right down here in Fells Point. Y'all go down to Fells Point sometimes, don't you? Yeah. Y'all go down to Fells Point. I know y'all be down to Fells Point. Down to Fells Point. Okay, that's where he grew up. Thames Street, that cobblestone street that nobody likes to drive across. Yeah. Right there, right there at the corner of Thames and Philpott Street, where they built that new Exelon place there. Frederick Douglass used to live right there on that corner. He used to live also up on Alisana Street, not too far from Washington Street, Alisana and Washington. Right there on Thames Street was a bookseller where Douglass bought this book called The Columbian Orator that he learned to speak from and learned to read from. And in all those shipyards that used to be down there is where he's taught himself and tricked people into teaching him how to read. But he was captured. He was sent to Baltimore to work in the house of his owner's brother, and he was to be a playmate for his son, and to run errands and whatnot and learn a trade. And the mistress, she used to teach Douglass how to read and write along with her son, until one day when the master came home and saw this happening. It's about 3 years after he was there. He already learned a lot. And he berated his wife. He told her that if you teach him to read and write, he will no longer be any good to himself or to us as a slave. And I'm paraphrasing it. He used different kinds of language. But that's what he told her. And Douglass was there, and he heard it. And it answered that question for him. That's how they keep us enslaved. They keep us ignorant. They don't let us learn. So from that point on, Douglas sought to learn as much as he could. And learning, along with spirituality, are key aspects of resistance that has been in our blood for the longest. That quest for knowledge and understanding of the world in which we live so that we could figure out how to survive in it, how to thrive in it, but most importantly, how to exist in balance with the Spirit. Because this is what this is what the ethos of black folks is. It is that spirituality, it is seeking that balance, to being in that God space. This is what we were fighting for. Now, I'm just one more thing, and I'll wrap it up here.
Thank you. Good.
The black church, right? Black church in the United States of America. Some people say it was started in Philadelphia. Some people say it was started right here in Baltimore, Bethel AME, as opposed to the Bethel in Philly. There was a minister here by the name of Daniel Coker. Daniel Coker was born out in Western Maryland. He escaped from slavery, went to New York, studied Methodism, and the black people down in Fells Point, and let me say this, Baltimore, during most of the 1800s, the antebellum period, had the largest concentration of free black people in the United States of America. There were over 17,000, 18,000 free black people. Only about 3,000 to 4,000 enslaved black people in Baltimore. Now, that's a curious thing in and of itself. How do you have in a slave state the largest population of free black people in the country? That don't make no sense. It doesn't. But a lot of things about this country don't make sense. I mean don't. When I say it, it just don't make no sense. And double negative is serious. Don't be making no sense. So I lost my train of thought. Run that back for me. So this idea of freedom that what was my train of thought? I'm telling too many jokes. Oh, the black church, AME church, right? Thank you. So we have Daniel Coker, who was brought back to Baltimore because the black folks in the Methodist Church want to start their own school, and the reason they want to start this school is so that they can teach themselves and their children how to read the Bible, so that they can interpret the Bible for themselves. Now, Methodists, a large reason why a lot of black folks joined the Methodist Church was because the Methodists at this time were opposed to slavery. So a lot of black folks joined the Methodist Church, but they still, the white folks in the Methodist Church still believed in white supremacy. They still believed that white people were better than black people, but y'all are worthy of being saved. But you still are not as good as us. This is why you have to sit in the back pews. You can't be ministers. You can be an orator. In the Methodist Church, they have people who go out and do classes. You could do that, but you can't be in the pulpit preaching. You can't do that. And this is what the rebellion was within the Methodist Church that brought the African Methodist Episcopal Church around. Many people say that it was because Richard Allen and the guys up in Philly, they were tired of being segregated in the pews. That wasn't it. It was because they were not allowed to be able to preach and interpret the Word of God in a way that made sense to them as descended African people. And this is what the resistance was. The first thing that black folks struggled for freedom for was freedom, was ecclesiastical freedom, was spiritual freedom, was the ability to be able to interpret the Word of God in a manner that made sense to them. And I argue that this is the root of the African retention that came across the Atlantic Ocean with us. That utamarahu, that ethos of spirituality. That even though we could no longer practice our traditional faiths or practice Islam or practice anything other than the Christianity that the European said we had to learn, we still yearn to take that and interpret it in our own way. You take how many of you watch these voodoo movies? Right? Don't believe the hype. It's voodoo. It is there's other faiths, Santeria, Candomblé. These are faiths that where Africans have taken the Catholic religion and combined it, syncretized it with African traditional faiths, and have made their own understanding and interpretation of their world using what they were forced to use by the Christians who said this is all you can have. And this is rooted in our spirituality. It survived. It is an Africanism, it is an African retention that came with us, that is still with us today. And that we experience here, you guys experience it every week. You still get it every day, that spiritualism. So I'm gonna end on that point, that the most important form of resistance that we as a people have exercised throughout our whole experience, through the Great Ma'afa, through the end of slavery, through the Reconstruction period, into the period of the Civil Rights Movement, even into today. The greatest form of resistance that we have put forward has been what you guys do here every week, what you do in your everyday walk. When you walk in the Spirit, that is resistance, because you are pushing back against wrong. You are pushing back against what is not right.
Yeah.
Resistance is not just fighting against, but you are fighting against something in order to create something else. And the thing that we as an African people have always fought to create is a just and fair world in our representation of God and Spirit. On that point, I thank you once again for having me this afternoon. I hope that I've had the chance to share something